Morning Lifehouse, and welcome to the second part of our just unpacking Romans 6, 7 and 8. And yesterday we looked at and we heard how Paul the Apostle talks about this amazing grace that we find ourselves in. And when we understand it and we have the high view that we should have of grace, people are not going to understand that. In fact, they're going to accuse us that we are casual about holiness and about righteousness, and that we are giving people a license to sin. And so Paul, in the first verse which we shared yesterday, says, what shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? And he emphatically answers that in verse 2, which we're going to cover this morning, is by no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? How can we go on sinning, is what Paul is saying. He said we're no longer under the rule of sin. We're under the rule of God's grace. And so it's not that it's not impossible for us to sin. Of course we can continue to sin, but it's foolishness and it's illogical, and ultimately it's just pure rebellion if we do so. And Paul gives us reasons why we should not and why we must not go on sinning, and he starts to unpack that through the rest of this chapter. But the first thing, as we see there, is he says because we've died. We've been transferred into a new realm of God's grace that rules over us. Notice that Paul does not tell us anything to do yet. He's telling us what has happened to us, not what we have to do, not what's going to happen. He's saying we've died to sin. Why should we live in it? Well, what does it mean to have died to sin? Because the problem with some of our translations, like the King James and others, says we are dead to sin. And that's kind of misleading, because it's not talking about our present state of being dead. In fact, what it should be doing is really spotlighting or highlighting the fact that we have been dead for a long time. It's dealing with an event that happened. And it's not dealing with our current state. It's actually dealing with what has happened. It was a definite once and for all and a single occasion. And think of it this way. In fact, Romans 5, 12 to 21, which is so important in terms of how we interpret this text, tells us that we were once in Adam. We used to sin. We find ourselves inherited. We inherited the nature of Adam, and we are subject to the death in Adam. And so I'm no longer in Adam because I've died. And the person that I used to be is gone forever. And secondly, it's the kind of this picture of the language of two kingdoms. It's like being transferred from one kingdom to another. That's what Colossians 1:13 tells us, that we've been transferred from the kingdom of darkness, where Satan rules, where he is king, where sin dominates the atmosphere, to a kingdom that Jesus is king, and where love, peace, and grace dominate. I've died to that territory. Excuse me. I've died to the reign and that authority in my life. And sin doesn't exist in the way that it did before. It doesn't have the dominion over me. It is obviously I can continue to sin, but it doesn't have that power over me. So it give you an example. It's imagine if I got transferred to the United States and I was driving like a lunatic down Manhattan in New York, and a South African policeman chases me down and pulls me over. Do you think that I'm going to be in trouble? Well, no, I can't. I'm not going to be in trouble with the South African authorities, because I'm not in their kingdom. I'm not in their regime. I'm not under their authority any longer. And the same is true for us as Christians, is that we've died to the regime of the kingdom, of the citizenship of sin. And it's not that I cannot sin, but it's the fact is that sin no longer rules over me. And we're going to read in verse 14 in the next couple of weeks, says, for sin shall no longer be my master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. So to consider it slightly differently, is Paul tells us in Romans 5 that death reigned in sin, and sin reigned in death. But I've died to that. So sin no longer reigns. It's righteousness that reigns. And Jesus reigns. Because why? Because I've died to sin. And I've died to that kind of phase of my existence, and sin no longer has a rule over me. This is not something that I'm trying to see happen. You know, I believed in Jesus, and the reign of sin came to an end. And that's why it's so important for Romans 6 that we read Romans 5, 12 to 21, because a death has taken place, a transfer has taken place, and we're not the person that we used to be. We've often heard the term, I'm dying to self, and really what that's trying to say is that I'm learning more and more to be less selfish. And I'm dying to self is a good thing. We want to become less and less selfish, and we want to resist our selfishness, but that's not what Paul's talking about here. It's not the way the word is being used in Romans 6 verse 2. He's not talking about what we ought to do. something that we maybe hope will progressively become more true with us. Now, Paul's referring to what has been done. And it's decisive, it's final, it's irreversible, and it makes sin to be defeated. I have died. Sin no longer has a claim or a real authority over my life. And so for those who are struggling with sin, come and read this text. You are no longer in the realm of sin. You're no longer under the authority of sin and Satan and darkness. You're under a new realm, a new authority. You have been transferred into a kingdom of light. What amazing news that is. I trust you have an amazing day. Cheers.